All right. So here's day two stuff of unit one, day two. Today, what we're going to be talking about is viruses, scientists, and the cell theory. So last class, what we talked about is we talked about the seven characteristics of life, and I usually talk about viruses with with that section. But this is always the first thing that we go over, and scientists and cell theory is such a short part. I just put it over here with it, just for the sake of the amount of notes to take and the length of the video. All right, so let's go ahead and get today going. So my first image here that I wanted to show you was basically just kind of let you know what some of the different things are. So if you don't know, this one right down here, this is an animal cell. The reason why I know this is an animal cell is I see that it's not a cuboidal in shape, or whenever I say that, it's not square or rectangular. It has a very fluid looking shape. I also know that it's definitely not a bacteria because the fact that it has all these structures on the inside of it. Um, Take a second to see if you know what any of these are, such as this one right here, this really big structure right here. See if you know what that one is. All right, that is a nucleus. If you're able to get that, that's a nucleus. Now this one over here, most of y'all probably knew what this one was pretty quick. This is a plant cell. Uh, Pretty easy to tell. It's usually very geometric. This one right here is rectangular in shape. It does have a nucleus. This big water structure, if any of y'all know what that is the large vacuole. And then also, you see how it has this really thick green outer layer? Well, that would be that cell wall. And then, of course, right here, these green structures inside of it. Well, that has a very important job only found in plant cells, as far as what we're talking about during ninth grade biology at this step in the game. These would be called the chloroplast. Then we have these two up here. Now, some people get a little bit confused by these two, so I'm going to go over this one first. Some of y'all probably do know what this is, but this is a bacterial cell. Now, if you notice, it doesn't have, like down here on the animal and plant cell, well, they have a nucleus, but this one doesn't. Well, that's a defining characteristic that we're going to talk about in Unit 3 is how are these two differently, or these different types of cells different? Really easy to, I'm just going to go over the basic structure of it. Bacterial cells usually look like a pill, kind of like a capsule pill, and then it has this tail that comes off of it. That's usually those defining characteristics. Now, this one right here, based off of what this today's information is about, you should be able to guess what this is. This alien-looking structure, this is a specific type of virus called a robovirus, and it's a good name for it because it looks like a robot. It actually does have DNA. And remember, DNA is a characteristic of life that's actually hidden up here, and then it has a protein code. It doesn't have any actual cellular functions or anything like that to it. So today, whenever we're talking about viruses, we're actually going to talk about why a virus is not considered a living thing, but these over here are. But we need to make sure that we do understand that viruses are not considered living, they are considered non living. Now, there is some dispute here, but amongst us, we're going to go ahead and go with non living because they do not meet all of the criteria generally accepted. So they do not meet all of the seven characteristics of life that we talked about last class. So we're going to go over some of that. So a primary reason that the viruses are considered non-living is they do not possess a cell membrane, nor do they metabolize on their own. They can't make their own energy or anything like that. They don't possess a cell membrane or a cell wall and outer coating. They don't possess those cellular structures. Viruses, and this is another big one. Now, most students are able to catch this one the easiest, but they forget about this other one. That's why I put the the cellular structures and metabolism first, is because so many students last year and the year before seemed to forget about those two. But they were always able to get this next one. Viruses can only replicate themselves, so they can only reproduce if a host cell is there basically to do it for them. So that's what they're doing. Whenever you get sick from a virus, that virus is infecting you, and it's infecting your cells in order to get that your cells to reproduce and make more of the viruses, and then they destroy that cell, and then they just keep going on and on doing that. So they need a host cell in order to reproduce. Now, viruses, they do contain DNA, so that means they do have part of this of those characteristics, but they remember they have to have all of them. And the reason why I put something on here about the protein coat is I noticed last year a lot of students were getting confused by, okay, well, if it has an outer coating, then that means it does have a cell wall. No, it does not. Remember, cell walls cover cells, cell membranes cover cells. Protein coats do not. But they do have a covering, but that covering is called a protein coat, not a cell wall. So this is talking about how I just want to give you an image and kind of walk you through it. So these right here are some of those roboviruses. So this is where it would start at. This is that attachment. The robovirus attaches, and then you notice this red stuff up here in the top of it. This red stuff up here in the top, that's supposed to represent its DNA. And whenever it attaches, it ejects the DNA. So you notice it ejected that DNA. That DNA is inside. Now this right here is it injecting it into a bacteria, because this right here would be its DNA over here. And there's not a nucleus. It could be the same thing if it was injecting it into a eukaryote, such as your cell, like an animal cell. Then your cell does what it's supposed to do. Your cell takes DNA and it makes copies of DNA. So whenever it makes copies of a viral DNA, that means it's making copies of viruses. And that's what we see happening. And then at the very end over here, we have the lysis stage, where basically the virus breaks loose. And now we've created many more viruses, and they're going to go and infect other cells. And that's why it takes you a little while from being getting introduced to a virus whenever you've first been around it to whenever you actually start feeling sick, because this takes several days for all of this to occur. Okay? But we need to make sure, remember that viruses are non-living. And I gave you those reasons why. So the next one is scientists. Now I did put the year on here. You won't have to know the year. I just put it on there because I do find it interesting. So we have Hooke. Hooke was the first scientist to identify and name cells. What he did is he actually looked at a piece of cork tree underneath an early, one of the very early and one of the first microscopes, and whenever he looked at it, it looked like a whole bunch of little squares everywhere. And so that's why he called them cells, is because they kind of look like a gel cell. Then you have this next scientist called Schleiden. Schleiden, he was the first scientist to note and to say that all plants are made up of cells. Now, if you notice, just 1 year later, this guy named Schwann, he was the first scientist to note that all animals were made up of cells. How I make sure I don't, because their names are similar, because that first sh, that SCH there, how I like to distinguish them, and I kind of came over this last year. If we dropped off that CH off of Schwann, it would just say swan, and swan is an animal. So that might be a little idiom there to kind of help you remember that Schwann noted that all animals were made up of cells. And then the last one is Virchow. Virchow proposed that all cells come from other cells. Well, that starts leading towards back to the theory of evolution, because if you keep going back, say, okay, if everything came from something living, then we have to keep going back, and keep going back. And that means that there would eventually only be one original cell, or whatever your thoughts are on that. So the next one is the cell theory. Now, whenever we talk about the cell theory, there are three parts of it, but you're also going to need to know what scientist or scientists said it or proposed it. So good thing here is that the first two are done both by Schleiden and Schwann. Schleiden and Schwann, They're the first ones to state that the cell is the basic unit of structure, so that the cell is, in other words, in the simpler terms, the cell is the basic unit of life. A single cell, that everything must have a single cell. If you remember, that goes back to our 7 characteristics, the very first one I put on the list. Second one is that all living organisms are made up of at least one cell. Now, it's important to note on this one right here, talking about the difference between 1 and 2 here, is that a lot of people, and even I've done in the past, I said, oh, well, what about Hooke? Where's Hooke at on this list? So even though Hooke was the first one to discover the cell, because of limiting in technology at the time, he didn't actually know that everything was made up of cells at this point, and he wouldn't have known that. He wouldn't have had the technology and the better microscope and the study and all the scientific evidence to point to this. But it is very important to note that if it were not for Hooke's discovery of the cell, then the very first cell theory here would not have been possible. So you had to first have somebody discover the cell, and then of course you had these two guys who did a lot of these two scientists who did a lot of study and research, who basically came up with the idea and the theory and first proposed that it was the basic unit of life. That there's nothing there, while there are things smaller than it, there's nothing that has life to where it is a living entity just as it. And the very last one is Virchow, that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So I want to go back real quick just to show you what he said. Right here at the bottom, Virchow proposed that all cells come from other cells. That is exactly what pre-existing means, is that all cells come from another cell, at least one other cell, that existed before it did. And so that's really all it is, just another term. And I do use the term pre-existing quite a bit when describing Virchow. So that's it, Fred. This right here is actually pretty short, and now you should know why I put viruses with it. So remember, we're going to need to know, in this pointer, you're going to need to know, is a virus a living organism? It is not a living organism. You'll also need to be able to know why. Remember, it cannot reproduce on its own. It needs a host cell. Also, it cannot make its own food. It can't use its own energy. It can't even absorb food from something else. So that means that energy component, it doesn't have it. It's not made up of cells or cell parts. Now remember, one of the confusing parts is DNA. Viruses do have DNA. So it does contain some of them. Viruses even evolve and change. But viruses are not living things. What are the 3 tenets? So whenever we say the 3 tenets, all that means is what are the 3 parts of the cell theory? That's that 1, 2, and 3 that was on the previous slide. You need to know who the 4 scientists are: Hooke, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow, and what they did. And also, how did these scientists contribute to the cell theory? And that was on the previous slide as well, where it talked about, Schleiden and Schwann, how they contributed to the first and second part tenets of the cell theory, and then Virchow contributed to the third. But please don't forget that if it were not for Hooke, the first one would not have been possible, because he's the one who discovered the cell. It just took a little bit longer, a little bit more technology, a little bit more study and research for Schleiden and Schwann to actually say that, the cell's the basic unit of life. Okay? Thanks.